Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. It wouldn't be a Digital Hammurabi stream if I didn't start it muted, would it? I swear, after 3 years, I should probably have this down. Anyway, hello everyone. Welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. Very nice to see you all. We have a very short live stream for you today. We're going to be talking to one of our HAPS applicants. I try and schedule everything in blocks, but understandably, students are very busy people, and that's not always possible. So we just have the one for you today, which will make it probably a little bit more manageable than last weekend, which was a bit of a marathon. So without further ado, here is Jacqueline. Hi, Jacqueline. How are you?
Hello, I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Would you mind, before we get started properly, just giving us a bit of an introduction to yourself and how you got into your field?
Sure. So my name is Jacqueline 𝀭or Jacqueline 𝀭if you live in America. I've been told to say my name both ways. So I am an Egyptology doctorate student at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and I have basically been studying Egyptology my whole life. It's a long story, but it started when I was 8 and never stopped. So here I am.
Excellent. I always love it when people say, well, I've just been doing this forever because when I was a kid, it was really interesting and I never really stopped. I think that resonates with an awful lot of people. Okay, would you like to get started and give us just a bit of background about what your research is on?
Sure. So my research is actually looking at the Near East and Egypt and what I like to call intercultural interactions or culture contact between the two regions. Specifically, I am looking at the Late Bronze Age, or relatively equivalent to the Egyptian New Kingdom, which is roughly 1550 to 1069 BCE. Specifically, I am looking at the Near Eastern goddess Anat. She is a hunter goddess, she is a warrior goddess, and she mainly appeared in the ancient Near Eastern city of Ugarit in Syria. She was very prominent there in the Ugaritic Baal cycle. She later made her way into Egypt, and what happened was during the New Kingdom of Egypt, around 1550 to 1069 BCE, as I said, Egypt was interacting on a supposedly much larger scale with the Near East than it had been prior. There were multiple accounts of immigrants coming over, multiple accounts of immigrant communities being set up. Near Eastern gods started to be worshipped within Egypt itself. There were actually 6 gods. Those are Horon, Reshep, Anat, Kadesh, Baal, and Astarte. My goddess Anat, she made her way into Egypt the very first time, from what my resources show, around 1895 BCE in the 12th dynasty. Basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at Anat and all of the evidence that we have of her interactions and her appearance within Egypt, and using that as a tool to better understand 3 main research questions, which are: how and why did Near Eastern deities find a foothold in Egypt? Why was she so popular? What made her so interesting to the Egyptian community that they would adopt and start worshiping a foreign deity when they already have so many warrior deities of their own? How interactions with the Near Eastern cultural other, and how did that impact late Bronze Age Egyptian identities of themselves? And how did Near Eastern people understand themselves in relation to migration and their new place within Egypt? So it's both anthropological and Egyptological. It's a little bit Near Eastern. And all of this comes together to basically show that culture contact has been happening for long before we could say, yeah, it's been happening for generations. And this is something that, yeah, I think is very important to be able to fully understand Egypt. We need to understand how the Egyptians saw themselves in relation to other people.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I have like a very brief background in Egyptology. My undergraduate was ancient history, which was like everything. Classics, Egyptology, Assyriology. If it was ancient, why not? And one thing that often comes up in that kind of broad education is you see things like the Romans taking Egyptian gods, but you don't hear so much about the Egyptians kind of adopting gods from other places. So that's really, really cool. Was Anat's worship limited geographically in Egypt, or do you find evidence throughout the region?
So I do want to stress that while I am head deep in the Anat material, there is not that much material. There are about 80 examples. I'm making basically a catalog of all known examples from her earliest appearance to the end of the New Kingdom. And this is roughly 80 objects.
Okay.
These 80 objects and 80 examples are basically the only known attestations we have, and they do range very broadly from the Nile Delta, so right where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, all the way down into the Egyptian fortresses that they used to have alongside Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan. So it is found quite throughout Egypt. There is a bit of a emphasis on the Theban region, so roughly in Middle Egypt. There is actually a emphasis on that area, but as far as the sheer quantity of information, I wouldn't say, she's not somebody that every single Egyptian person knew and worshipped. She was selected. She did make it into the royal pantheon, which I think is very interesting, but that's a whole other story. So,
thank you. And when you're looking at these objects, what kinds of things are we talking about?
We're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about door jambs where Anat may have been written. We're talking about potential temples to Anat. The capital of Egypt during the time of Ramses II, Pi-Ramses, whose objects were later moved to Tanis, supposedly there was actually a temple of Anat along with other Near Eastern deities that was set up there. We're talking about personal names. So I have an entire chapter dealing with Egyptians or people of questionable background who may have had Anat as their name for various reasons. We have people named son of Anat, daughter of Anat, maidservant of Anat. Anat is victorious. We also have scarabs. The earliest examples come from scarabs of very small rulers, probably of the 12th dynasty or second intermediate period. It's a wide variety of information. I'd say the largest category that we have at the moment speaking about Anat is papyri.
Okay. That's really interesting. Is there, does it seem as though there's a like a social element to this? Is it restricted to elite people, or do you see it throughout? And sorry, I'm asking these questions. I know that you haven't finished your research yet. So if these are questions that haven't been answered yet, please just go ahead and say I'm kind of springing this on you.
It's fine. So I am a long-term doctoral student. I am in my 5th year at the moment. I am still quite a lot to go, but everything that I've done has been really fruitful to now, I can happily say. And I do have answers to your questions because I recently wrote that chapter.
Excellent timing.
So, according to previous researchers, Anat was mainly worshipped by the elite, by the pharaoh himself. Ramses II, he had a daughter named Bint Anat, which means daughter of Anat. Ramses II was also known to take foreign wives in his courts, so that could have some kind of link to that. He had a dog named after Anat. He had a sword named after Anat. Seti I had a chariot span named after Anat. So previous scholars have really taken the obvious examples and kind of pushed this narrative that Anat was really limited to the elite. However, when we look at Anat in personal names, so names that the average everyday person has, we actually find some really interesting information that suggests that Anat was at least known in whatever amount to all areas of Egyptian society. Even I think the lowest rank is a very difficult term, of course, when you're talking about the ancient world, but we do actually have records of an Egyptian farmer named after Anat. We have records of average doctors, we have scribes. So from my research, it really seems like she was appearing, at least in personal names, throughout society.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. So now I've kind of grilled you totally uncalled for. Sorry about that. On your research, what are your plans for this summer, and how do you think HAPS will be able to help you with the funding?
So, like I said, I am a long-term researcher, a long-term doctorate student. What that actually means is that I am an unfunded doctorate student who is currently working part-time at a Starbucks in order to fund my research. I do have a small scholarship from a very nice Jewish foundation here in Basel that is ending, I believe, June or July. And basically what I would like to do with the HAPS money, if awarded, is to continue my research on my catalog, to finish the database basically of every single Lanat object that we have found in Egypt up until the end of the New Kingdom in 1069 BCE, because this will be the very first complete database, very first complete published catalog of every single object known. This, of course, takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of me looking up all sorts of things in languages that I'm not necessarily fluent in, but I'm working on. But the idea really is to be able to use this money to spend more time researching and less time behind the bar making frappuccinos for people.
Which is exactly why we offer the money, because your research is, to me personally, much more interesting and much more important than working in Starbucks. And presumably it's what you'd prefer to be doing also. So we're going to go to the chat and see if people have questions for you. And we have one from Jim. He is asking if Anat remained as popular in Egypt after the Hyksos were expelled.
So I assume when we're talking about the Hyksos being expelled, that we're talking about the end of the Second Intermediate Period, early New Kingdom. And actually, we have very little evidence of Anat from the Second Intermediate Period. There are only two pieces of evidence that we have. Both of them are scarabs of people named Aperanati and Aperher. Both seem to have been small, either noblemen or like local provincial rulers. But actually, the majority of information we have about Anat is from after the so-called Hyksos being expelled. And it should very clearly be stated that even at the end of the Second Intermediate Period, saying that the Hyksos were expelled, they were expelled from the government. That doesn't mean that all of the people who were living there, who had families there, who were merchants, who were scribes, anyone who had worked there prior, that doesn't necessarily mean that they went back to the Near East. So it's very difficult at the moment to trace Anat's the full scale of Anat's representation within the Second Intermediate Period, but at least from the evidence, the majority of it comes actually from later.
Fascinating, thank you. And when so this is my question because I'm waiting for everybody in the audience to come up with their own. When we're looking at things like cultural contact and the transmission of gods, what kind of social interactions do you imagine gave rise to this kind of movement of deities?
Well, there's a lot of things. I mean, if we're looking at the Near Eastern migrants themselves, I've been looking a lot at anthropological theories of cultural translation, of cultural heritage. And so you have these questions of, you know, when people move to a new place, what are the core things that link them back to their homeland, that make them feel part of a community? Was Anat maybe a means of remaining and keeping a connection to that Near Eastern heritage while in a new land? We also have to think about cultural translation, Egyptian people meeting a merchant or a scribe or whoever from the Near East, having, you know, sitting down over lunch or something, talking about what they believe in, and suddenly realizing, hey, this god isn't so different from my own, or this goddess isn't so different from my own. How can I understand that in my own way? And that actually becomes very interesting because there are quite a few comparison studies that suggest that Anat was seen kind of in relation to the Egyptian goddess Hathor, who also had this warrior type, but also motherly role. That's something I hadn't mentioned before. While in Egypt, Anat actually gained some new roles that weren't in the Near East. One of them being this kind of motherly role. She becomes the mother of the pharaoh. Ramses II and other pharaohs are always talking about how they were nursed by her, how they were her child. And that has really remarkable parallels to Hathor.
That was actually going to be my next question, if she kind of syncretized to other Egyptian deities during her time in Egypt. That's very interesting. So I know that your research ends in the New Kingdom. Do you see towards the end of that period a decrease in Anat, or does it look like her worship continues past your own research interest area?
So Anat was always very closely associated with Astarte, who's another Near Eastern goddess. They were linked in the Near East, and they were linked within Egypt. And so in this way, Anat and Astarte continued on after the Egyptian New Kingdom. Mostly the information that we have is of Astarte, but a lot of times if you actually look at the evidence itself, you'll notice that scholars are making their best guess, and that it's not actually 100% clear, at least in representations, whether we're talking about Anat or whether we're talking about Astarte. So I would definitely argue that Anat's worship had continued on into Greco-Roman Egypt even, but in what kind of form, it's hard to say because of how similar she is to other goddesses.
Thank you very much. And we have time for one more question before we let Jacqueline go. So Matt is asking, what got you interested in this subject? So I assume by that he means Anat specifically rather than Egyptology.
Sure. Well, I have always been really interested in cultural interactions and how different cultures understand themselves in relation to other people. Originally, I was actually a food specialist. I was looking really at the cultural interactions that surrounded food and food consumption. But this led my master's down the road of actually looking more at, I was using basically pottery from the Egyptian fortresses on the Nubian border, so again in modern day Sudan, to understand how the Egyptian people were interacting with local Nubian populations at these fortresses. And that during the course of that research, I kind of realized that my real interest wasn't so much in the food, it was in the social interaction surrounding that. And then I began researching, how can I explore this kind of cultural context study further? And I heard about these 6 gods that were entered into Egypt during the late Bronze Age. And I realized there's actually quite a lot of research that hasn't been done, simply because some research is outdated, because people haven't considered personal names, for instance, because people didn't necessarily, the previous writers hadn't gone so much into the anthropological background. There tends to be a lot of research on Anat as far as what she looked like and what she appeared as in texts, but not so much on what she actually meant to the people. And it's hard because you can never say this is what an Egyptian person thought of Anat. You just can't. And you can't say this person was using Anat as a means of maintaining contact to the past. But these kinds of questions are really important to be brought up to remind ourselves that these people from the past aren't so different from people today. And so the more I thought about that, the more I realized that this was a topic that needed to be discussed, especially with the whole question of growing globalism and things like that today. And Basel was the perfect place for it. So that's how that comes together.
Thank you so much. That's a really fascinating answer. I'd love hearing about people's research and how they came to it. And we are officially out of time. So Jacqueline, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Good luck with your dissertation, and we will be in touch shortly.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And everybody in the chat, thank you so much for joining us. I know this one was a little bit short notice. That's entirely my fault. I arranged this with Jacqueline and then probably forgot about it because there's no real excuse. I just did. So thank you all for being here anyway. Reminder, if you are new to the concept of HAPS and you would like to vote for which research you would like to see funded, you may become a HAPS patron or donor. You just go to hapsfund.com/donor. just along the bottom of the screen now, /donate, sorry. Any donation amount gives you a vote in the process. We don't give extra votes based on how much people are able to afford. We just want to get you engaged and invested in the amazing research that PhD students are carrying out. So again, thank you all so much. We have more HAPS interviews tomorrow. I believe we start at 11 a.m., but the stream is up on YouTube, so go and check and make sure I'm not misleading you. And I hope you all have a lovely Saturday afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.